Dear friends and colleagues, welcome to Mexico City. Today, after more than a year of hard work, this gala event finally begins. The Economics Department of CIDE and the International Economic Association cordially welcomes you to the 18th World Congress. We are honored to have many distinguished guests today. We have Mr. José Antonio Meade, Finance Secretary, Government of Mexico, Mr. Francisco Guzman, Chief of Staff, Office of the President of Mexican Republic, Mrs. Julia Tagueña, Director of Scientific Development, the National Council of Science and Technology, CONACYT, Mr. Tim Besley, President of International Economic Association and Professor of Economics and Political Science at the London School of Economics, Mr. Kaushik Basu, President-elect, International Economic Association and Professor of Economics at the Cornell University, Mr. Sergio López Ayllón, Director of CIDE, Mrs. Jimena Moreno, General Secretary of CIDE, Mr. Alejandro López Feldman, Chair of the Economic Department at CIDE. I would like to request Mr. López Ayllón to say some words on behalf of CIDE.
Good morning, José Antonio Meade, Secretary of Finance, Francisco Guzman, Chief of Staff of the President of Mexico, Julia Tagueña, Deputy General Director of the Mexican Council of Science and Technology, Professor Tim Besley, President of the International Economic Association, Professor Kaushik Basu, President-elect of the International Economic Association, Jimena Morena, Alejandro López Feldman, dear friends of the American Economic Association. Welcome to Mexico City, and welcome to CIDE. It is an honor for CIDE to host, along with the International Economic Association, the 18th World Congress. Over 700 economists from around the world have to travel to meet in Mexico and discuss some of the most relevant challenges of our time for economic science, economic policy, and for the future of the world. Let me take a few minutes to introduce CIDE, and we will show you a very short video. Please.
El Centro de Investigación y Docencia Económicas, CIDE, es una institución de excelencia especializada en ciencias sociales que responde a los retos de México con rigor y seriedad académica. Docencia, investigación, divulgación y vinculación con la sociedad son los pilares del quehacer académico del CIDE, una institución que forma parte de la red de centros públicos de investigación del Consejo Nacional de Ciencia y Tecnología, CONACYT.
Thank you. During its almost 5 decades of existence, CIDE has consolidated as a center for relevant theoretical and empirical debate concerning the national and international academic agenda and has generated knowledge for public policy making. Many of Mexico's recent and current reforms have been developed, assessed, or promoted at CIDE, from competition policy to transparency and anti-corruption, from telecom regulation to social policy evaluation, or from drug policy to migration. Our economic department is small, only 31 researchers, but it is strong, productive, and influential. Over the past decades, the department has consistently ranked among the top economic departments in Latin America. It also houses the Latin American Economic Review. Despite its inception only 3 years ago, the journal has already become the leading economic journal in Latin America. I would like to deeply thank the International Economic Association for giving us the opportunity to co-organize these congresses. We are also grateful to El Consejo Mexicano de Negocios, TATA, HFD, Share Energy and Prosperity, Google, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the World Bank for sponsoring this event. Thanks also to the local organizing committee, Professors Susan Parker, Fausto Hernandez, Kanish Kadam, and Alejandro Lopez Feldman, and of course to all the CIDE staff and students that have worked hard to make sure everything is ready. Finally, I want to thank our friends at the Mexican government, Secretary Meade, Francisco Guzman, and Julia Tagüeña, for their continued support to CIDE. During the next days, you will discuss different issues on globalization, growth, and sustainability. I am confident that your work will enlighten our understanding of these problems and will help to find new and creative solutions. Moreover, this Congress will give us further evidence that is through science and dialogue, and not prejudice or isolation, that we can build bridges among cultures and countries, and that academic global networks are key factors to build the foundations of a better future for every woman and man on earth. Congratulations and welcome again.
I would now invite Mrs. Tagüeña to say a few words.
Señor Secretario, Doctor José Antonio Meade, Maestro Francisco Guzmán, Jefe de la Oficina de la Presidencia de la República. Thank you very much, Dr. Sergio López Ayón, the Director of CIDE, for this invitation. Also, thank you to Jimena Moreno and Alejandro López from CIDE as well. It is a great honor to have with us Dr. Tim Besley, President of the International Economic Association, and Dr. Kaushik Basu, President-elect of the International Economic Association. The Director General of the National Council for Science and Technology, CONACYT, Dr. Enrique Cabrero, deeply regrets not being to attend this 18th Congress of the International Economic Association since he is out of the country. On his behalf, I wish you all a very successful meeting full of new ideas and a lively exchange of knowledge. The National Council of Science and Technology was founded in 1971 as Mexico's scientific community expanded. It concentrates different efforts to both promote the generation of knowledge and innovation, and to better position our country in the international landscape. All scientific disciplines are covered by our work, from health, natural sciences, to social sciences. CONACYT reports directly to the President of Mexico. It has a board of governors that is chaired precisely by the Secretary of Finance, Dr. Meade, who has been a strong supporter of the efforts to generate a more dynamic system of science and technology. Our coordination with the Ministry of Finance is fundamental to ensure the efficient use of public funds in science and technology and to foster private investment in research and development. Mexico also has a General Council of Scientific Research, Technological Development and Innovation. It is headed by the President of Mexico and has been convened every year by President Peña, with the presence of all Secretaries of State with related responsibilities, as well as members of the academic community and industry. CONACYT operates 24 sectorial funds that finance scientific and technological projects on different subjects within the line of our policy. In areas such as health, social development, housing, sustainability, security, and environment. Since 2002, we have also a Science and Technology Consulting Forum, through which we benefit from the knowledge and views of the academic community and other actors, such as the private sector and legislators. In this administration, the Office of the President has a coordination of science, technology, and innovation. Francisco Guzman is also a great supporter of science. Mexico is a federal republic, and therefore all 32 states have local science and technology councils. CONACYT chairs the Commission of Science and Technology of the National Conference of Governors, created in 2004, with the aim of fostering regional development. Dialogue with the legislative branch is likewise a priority, as it approves the budget for each sector every year. A final component of our system is the 27 CONACYT research centers, among them the Center of Economic Research and Education, CIDE. They cover a wide variety of fields and have established alliances to maximize their potential, such as the creation of research consortiums with links to the industry. A famous Mexican astronomer, Guillermo Haro, before the creation of CONACYT, described our academic community in the following way: almost without background, in the middle of the 20th century, we start our road. We will have to create everything: research institutes, laboratories, with discipline, tradition, and stubbornness. We can be proud of what the science and technology system has accomplished since. It has given more than 300,000 scholarships to young people to obtain master's degrees and PhDs. Our national system of researchers covers over 20,000 members, and 38 of them are women, and this figure is steadily growing. We coordinate sectors, collaborate internationally, and have world-class universities and research centers. And yet, it is clear that our work is far to be complete. We must reinforce the institutional design of CONACYT upon our 2020-2030 Science, Technology, and Innovation Plan. We seek to increase the links between academia and business, to develop all regions of Mexico, and to consolidate our relations with strategic countries and organizations. Because all of this, the international meetings are very important. This International Congress is important, and we advance together to these goals. We welcome you all to Mexico and encourage you to keep working with the Mexican counterparts and to encourage further generations of researchers. Your collaboration is important to us. Thank you very much.
I would now request Francisco Guzman to have a few words.
Mr. Secretary of Finance, Mr. President and Mr. President-elect of the International Economic Association, esteemed CONACYT and CIDE authorities, distinguished speakers and experts. First and foremost, I would like to thank the International Economic Association and CIDE for organizing this important event. Congratulations to the local organizing committee. On behalf of President Enrique Peña Nieto, welcome to Mexico. He hopes you have a very pleasant and productive stay in our country, and he truly appreciates your trust for selecting Mexico to host this 18th World Congress. Personally, I am thrilled to be here because I am a fellow colleague, and as some of you may know, CIDE is my alma mater. It is very inspiring to meet some of the most brilliant minds in economics. Considering that the theme of the Congress is globalization, growth, and sustainability, I believe Mexico is a perfect fit as a host. First, Mexico strongly believes that globalization can be a positive force for development and progress. Currently, our country is one of the most open and globally integrated economies in the world. We have an extensive network of free trade agreements with 46 nations and have become one of the most sought-after destinations for foreign direct investment. In 2016, Mexico's total trade amounted to more than $760 billion. In terms of trade to GDP, Mexico is the third most open economy of the G20, only behind Germany and Korea. According to the World Trade Organization, Mexico ranked as the 12th largest exporter worldwide and the first in Latin America and the Caribbean, reflecting an unprecedented effort to diversify our exports and reduce our dependence on commodities such as oil. Last year, FDI inflow was $26.7 billion, 10 times the investment that we received in 1990. Second reason, Mexico is an example of structural change to boost growth. In the last few years, the adoption and implementation of important structural reforms have allowed us to increase our productivity and overall competitiveness. We managed to pass reforms in the areas of energy, finance, labor, competition, telecom, fiscal policy, education, transparency, and anti-corruption. The underlying objective behind all of these reforms is to align incentives towards better institutional and economic outcomes to reach greater, more balanced, and more inclusive growth. The transformation we have witnessed in our country in recent years contrasts sharply with the division, disagreement, and gridlock that tend to characterize politics. According to the OECD, Mexico is one of the few countries that have passed comprehensive structural reforms in recent years. We have done so in a democratic framework. Finally, the third reason we are a perfect fit for this World Congress is that Mexico is a global player that actively advocates for greater multilateral efforts to ensure sustainability. We have proudly joined worldwide efforts to tackle climate change, and we're the first developing country to present its intended nationally determined contributions, its INDCs, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions as part of our deep commitment to the Paris Agreement. We also actively participated in defining the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which promotes inclusive growth that leaves no one behind. Despite our progress, as a country, we still have a long way to go. We must continue to implement these ambitious structural reforms and address both historical and emerging challenges, including persistent income and gender gaps. This administration has worked hard on building a new development platform from which Mexico can now move faster and farther. Based on what we have accomplished over the last decades, we need to move forward and prepare ourselves for upcoming challenges such as automatization and artificial intelligence. We are confident and certain that Mexico has a brilliant future ahead. We believe we have the ability to harness the potential of these structural reforms and new technologies and use them to boost human development forward. The fact that the International Economic Association has decided to host its 18th World Congress in our country is a very strong signal of this positive future. I would like to end these words with an invitation to consider Mexico in your future research agendas. We are undergoing countless changes that I am sure would make for very interesting papers. President Peña Nieto's government is convinced that knowledge enhances policy and decision-making, and we always look forward to working with esteemed international researchers and learn from them and their recommendations. I want to thank you all for being here, and once again, welcome to Mexico. We hope you feel at home and find the opportunity to get to know our country and perhaps fall in love with it. Thank you very much.
Now, Professor Kaushik Basu will speak on behalf of the International Economic Association.
Mr. Secretary of Finance, Jose Antonio Meade, distinguished colleagues and friends on the dais, and delegates from around the world who have gathered here today for the start of the conference. I treat this as a matter of both honor and joy to be able to welcome all of you to the 18th World Congress of the International Economic Association here in Mexico City, hosted by CIDE. And Sergio Lopez, a special thanks really for hosting this and making the start such a wonderful occasion. We know from the 18th century and the writings of Adam Smith that an economy grows and prospers if human beings strive, work harder, do trade, and try to do well for themselves. What is not so widely talked about, but is equally true, is that an economy runs and prospers because we confer, we debate, we bring the best of our minds to think about our challenges, and we try to promote our collective interest. Historically, the promotion of collective interest was confined to in-groups, the community, the class, the nation. But we have reached a stage in the world today where if we are to survive, we have to come together globally to confer and promote the common interest of humanity. From climate change through trade and monetary policy to tackling inequality, the challenge increasingly is an international one. One reason why the world seems to be coming apart, and there are unfortunate stories from around the world, is that economic globalization has proceeded faster than our political and social commitments to deal with this. For this reason, researchers and intellectuals, among them economists, political scientists, sociologists, scientists proper, physicists and chemists, progressive political leaders have a special responsibility to come together to exchange ideas, bring the best of science to bear on our biggest challenges. We need determination and passion, true, but we also need critical thinking, data and statistics, the best of economic theory to take stock of where we stand and how we will meet the challenges. It is in that spirit that starting today we will be conferring, presenting papers and debating policies at this 18th World Congress over the next 5 days. I'm really looking forward to that. On behalf of iEA, I once again want to thank CIDE for helping organize this great event. And actually from registrations that have taken place, this is turning out to be one of the biggest congresses of the iEA, and we hold a congress once every 3 years. So it's not that many times, but it is turning out to be quite remarkable. The Mexican economy is an excellent example of a nation caught up in all the challenges of the modern global world. It has done important reforms. It has signed multiple free trade agreements, and it seemed poised for very rapid growth till recently. But before that could happen, Mexico got drawn into controversy with the United States, with NAFTA now coming under strain, and there is generally a form of xenophobic protectionism in many advanced industrialized countries, which is causing a challenge to Mexico. I emphasize that these are short-term problems because I believe that the current difficulties are really an opportunity for Mexico to break itself from some of the old mold and forge ahead with creating new economic partnerships. In a column that I wrote, newspaper column in March this year, much before I knew I would be speaking at the inauguration, I mentioned that given the rise of protectionism in the rich world, there are a couple of emerging economies which stand a very good opportunity to do well, and in that cluster I had named China, which most people will agree does belong there, and more paradoxically and surprisingly, I had mentioned Mexico. It is likely that this year Mexico's growth will drop below 2%. There are some hard times ahead, no doubt about that. There is reason to expect that as a result of a more restrictive immigration policy in the United States, remittance to Mexico will drop. There are studies, formal research studies, which show that thanks to NAFTA, Mexico's labor productivity had risen. This may also come under some strain, but all this can have the side effect of opening up Mexico in a way that has not happened maybe since before World War II, when Mexico actually used to interact a lot with the world. As a result, there is every reason to hope that Mexico can get to a 5% growth within the next 3 years. Mexico had crossed the 5% growth mark on a couple of occasions in the mid-1990s for a few years, and in some of the years in the first decade of this century. It is possible for Mexico to get onto a sustained 5% growth path and join the club in this region of Panama, for instance, is another country doing that, but across the world there is a small cluster of countries growing that rapidly. The key will be to build trade, enhance human capital and physical capital, and nurture investment links with the emerging world, from China through India to sub-Saharan Africa and of course Latin America, more at your doorstep. The current turmoil and challenge will create new opportunity, innovation and creativity. Mexico must seize that opportunity. And Mr. Secretary, you can count on the International Economic Association to be engaged intellectually in terms of research. Mr. Guzman referred to that already in any way that we can help in this endeavor. For this World Congress, we have assembled some of the finest minds from around the world. We have 3 Nobel laureates who will be speaking: Joseph Stiglitz, George Akerlof, and Roger Myerson. We have some of the world's finest economists doing cutting-edge research and some of the most talented policymakers who have gathered here for discussion and debate. We hope that the conference will stimulate research in the entire region of Latin America and the Caribbean. This is a region which is actually very active in research, but we can stimulate and do more. And through that, promote growth and all-around development. I mean, that's what we are really after, inclusive, all-around development rather than just growth. In closing, I want to say a special word to thanking the local hosting group. It has been a pleasure to work with Fausto Hernandez Trillo, Kanish Kadam, who's announcing here, Alejandro Lopez Feldman, and Susan Parker. It has been a very long haul organizing this, as Tim Besley here knows, Omar Licandro knows. We've been having phone conversations, Skype meetings, and we've also had physical meetings in Washington, in New York, and in Mexico City, all building up over the last 2 years for this very occasion. And very special thanks to Andrea Cavallo, who's really shouldered a whole lot of the details of the organization, leaving us relatively free to think about other things while she does that. There have been groups that have sponsored us, organizations that have provided money, and we will be recognizing all of them, but I should just mention over here, Consejo Mexico de Negocios has been very generous and helped us. Very early when I began organizing this, the Tata Group from India, Agence Française from France helped us with finance, and once we knew early that the money was coming, it actually made things possible for us and made it easier. Thank you, and thank you to the other groups that have sponsored, and there will be occasion to do more detailed stock taking and thanking people for this. Finally, I want to mention that I personally, my friends know that I love Mexico. I've been here several times. I love the art in this country, so I want to give a special thank you to an artist who is represented her work in the corridors over here, Patricia Henriquez, whose work you will be able to see as you walk around over here. So I'm just absolutely delighted that has happened. So once again, to the local organizers and to all of you who have come from all corners of the world, thank you very, very much. I'm hoping that we will make these 5 days a very successful event. Thank you.
Now Dr. Mead will deliver his inaugural speech.
Thank you, and good morning. I'm very, very happy to be here at what has been described as the Olympics of the economic world. It takes place every 3 years, so that makes it on a different cycle. And this year it will not coincide with the Olympics, which is why probably all of these people came, because they now have time to think about the economy rather than think about the Olympics. But I am really happy to be here, and I prepared a small presentation that I think will provide some elements, some context as to how the Mexican economy is doing, and it may provide some answers and provoke some research, more or less in the line as Professor Basu was suggesting. I'm very happy to know that CIDE is now hosting this event. I presented a job market paper at CIDE with the hopes of them hiring me. Since they didn't, I made a career out of politics, and I've been minister some time, so I hope they reconsider next time around they have the chance to hire. The next one. As in many other things in economics, context is relevant, context is important. And the context that the Mexican economy has had to operate with the last couple of years has been very difficult. Professor Basu made reference to the difficulties that we've had in recent weeks in terms of the debate around NAFTA, but beyond the recent weeks, the last couple of years have been difficult for emerging economies, and they have been difficult for Mexico in particular. So when you look at Mexico's numbers, it's always relevant to have some elements in terms of context. And just to put the context idea into play, from example, outside of typical economics, one can look at examples of countries, teams doing well under a difficult context and difficult scenarios. Most of you are not new to the idea. It was written and explained in Moneyball by Michael Lewis, which sort of focused on the Oakland Athletics. They were a team that did well, even though they were a team that for different reasons had a relatively low budget to spend in the attraction of top talent. They did well, they looked at their numbers, they found value in players that were sometimes overlooked, and that means that paying a fraction of what they paid as compared to the New York Yankees, there was a season where they actually won just as many games. And one can find examples of teams overperforming in terms of the context, just as one can find examples of economies overperforming the context, and that's what makes looking at those teams and looking at those countries interesting. Just recently, the Confederation Cup, Mexico's football team is worth roughly, in terms of the value of the players, $165.7 million. Chile is worth roughly the same. Portugal pays their players almost twice as much. So that means that time with Portugal yesterday was actually quite a good result for Mexico. That probably is taking a lot of just one data point, but the gist of the idea is that one should look at the performance relative to context rather than just at the performance alone. Probably more meaningful, the Warriors just won the NBA championship after having participated for the last 3 years. They are the 14th team in terms of payroll. They spend roughly the same as the Bulls do. The Warriors spent almost $100 million, so did the Bulls. The Warriors won 73 games last year and the championship. The Bulls did not. The Cavaliers, whom the Warriors defeated, spent $125 million. They not only won less games, but they also managed to lose the championship, even though they overspent the Warriors. So again, there's something about what the Warriors are doing that's worth looking at and that's worth understanding. The interesting thing about it is that it evolves, and once everybody understands what the Warriors are doing, the teams and the MBA would have to continue to innovate in terms of strategy to continue to overperform. More closely to educational research, one way to look at the value of universities is how much the pay increases once one finishes school as compared to when one was at the beginning of school. The University of New Mexico, the pool of students that they get is not amongst the top 20 as measured by the SATs. But once they finish school there, they ranked 22nd in terms of the highest starting salaries after graduation. That is not the most valuable metric, but it is interesting to compare them, for example, with Yale, where I studied my graduate degree. They get the highest ranked students. I agree with that part of the study. Yale does get, I think, good students. But they rank 19th in terms of highest starting salaries after graduation, very similar to what New Mexico does. Of course, there are differences. Yale has a lot of graduates that go into public work, and public work is typically less well paid than work in other fields, especially finance. But still, there's something that New Mexico is probably doing well, where they get good students and make them better in terms of how much the market appreciates them, as compared to universities like Yale or Stanford, which get a better pool of students and don't add as much value in terms of the starting salary. The next one. Having all of that in consideration, what is the context that Mexico's faced over the last couple of years? Again, not just the last couple of months, which have been very difficult for Mexico, but the last couple of years in general, because that provides context. And it's a context that's not dissimilar to what has happened with other emerging markets in the region. First, just as compared to 2014, which is a couple of years back, oil production has fallen from 2.4 million barrels of oil per day to 2.1. If one goes a bit further, in 2004, Mexico was producing 3.3 million barrels of oil per day. The average of the last administration was 2.7. That means that within an administration, Mexico lost the equivalent of the oil production of Colombia. That's a big number, and that's an important drag for growth. The price of oil at the beginning of 2014, the price of oil of the Mexican mix was above 100. Today, it's 44, and we're actually happy because in February of last year, it was 18. That's a drop of more than 80% in the price of oil for an oil-producing country for which oil revenues were an important part of public revenues. So the energy context was very complex, and an argument similar to this could be made of many commodities to which many emerging economies are contingent on. From the perspective of tax policy, Mexico, like many other economies, used the fiscal space they had available to counter first the economic crisis of 2009, and then to accompany the economic reforms and the fiscal reform. We ran out of fiscal space, so we're now consolidating. That means that from a fiscal perspective, we're not getting an additional stimulus to foment growth in our economy. That's also true in terms of our monetary policy. We are now in a cycle, in a period of the cycle, where the central bank is tightening its monetary policy. Fiscal and monetary will contribute to growth long term. The fact that there's certainty on the way that we're managing our public finances and the fact that inflation expectations are well anchored are two elements that provide strength and growth in the future for the Mexican economy. For 2016 and 2017, fiscal and monetary are also a drag on growth. The variable that Mexico's economy used to be more synced with used to be the production, the U.S. industrial production. We are an exporter country, as was said here, so the fact that U.S. industrial production doesn't grow is also a drag on our economy. And for the last couple of years, that has happened. Industrial production in the U.S. has had negative growth for the last 2 years. We expect it to be positive this year, so that should help the Mexican economy do better. International trade for an open economy such as Mexico has not enjoyed a lot of growth. Just from 14 to 16, it went from 2.8 to 1.3. And in general, growth around the world has been pretty anemic. And every time we talk about growth, the surprises have been to the negative. We economists have to spend the first part of every one of our lectures explaining why the forecast that we made for economic growth is not going to be met. The first positive surprise that we've had in terms of global growth is probably 2017, where people are now more optimistic than the original forecasts were at the beginning. All of these elements taken together, were we able to go back to the numbers that we had in 2014, the growth of the Mexican economy would be 2 points of GDP higher. So the context means an important drag in Mexican growth just because of all of that. And if you add to that mix the uncertainty about policy, trade policy in the US, that makes it even more complicated. So what numbers are we seeing coming out of the Mexican economy? If you look just at the first trimester, GDP grew 2.8% on an annualized basis. We created 431,000 jobs. Retail grew almost 3%. Credit grew almost 10%. The agricultural sector was growing at 6.6% on average. Manufacturers' production grew above 5%. Private consumption almost 5% as well. The sales of automobiles, 5.8%. Economic activity, 4.4. Exports, 9.2. Imports, 5.5. As was highlighted by Frank, foreign direct investment to Mexico in the first trimester of this year was 30% higher to what it was in the last trimester of last year. 20 of 21 institutions have raised their estimates of Mexico's growth for 2017, and the increase is roughly 35%. So the numbers coming out of Mexico are quite good in and of itself, but they're much better if one takes into consideration the context under which these numbers are generated. If you add the 2% drag that all of these elements had to the 2.8 that we're seeing, we're pretty much at the 5% that Professor Basu suggested. So that means that from a structural perspective and from a platform of growth perspective, all of the elements are there in the Mexican economy, but the context that we have faced is a particularly difficult context. So why are we doing well relative to context? We're doing well, again, in absolute terms. We're doing better than the rest of Latin America. We compare well to the OECD. We're going to grow a little bit more than the US is growing. But specifically, relative to context, why is Mexico's economy doing well? And that's something that, as Frank said and Professor Basu said, warrants probably further research. But a good hypothesis is that the structural reforms have indeed worked, that the structural reforms have changed the way that the Mexican economy functions so as to make it more modern, more flexible, more complex, and therefore more resilient to the difficult context that we face. You cannot understand Mexico today without the energy reform. The commitments of the bidding processes that have been held so far are to the tune of more than $70 billion. That's a lot of money that's committed to be invested in Mexico just in energy. It's difficult to understand Mexico today and its public finances without the fiscal reform. We lost 5 points of GDP of oil revenue and substituted those by 5 points of GDP of fiscal revenue. Education reform has been important in the short run in terms of the investments in infrastructure that we've made and should be relevant in the longer run. Telecommunications reform has changed the industrial organization of that sector and provide both a magnet for growth and an additional layer of competitiveness. It's hard to understand a labor creation of 2.7 million jobs in the administration in the absence of labor reform and the flexibility that that brought with it. And it's hard to understand the growth in our private consumption market in the absence of financial reform. So if you take all of these reforms together, you start to understand why there's resilience in the Mexican economy, why we're doing better than Latin America and other emerging markets that have faced similar shocks, and why we have continued to grow throughout a very difficult environment, and one could actually at some point identify exactly how much more resilience and how much more growth each one of these structural reforms have already contributed to the growth of the Mexican economy. I'll end with just two further considerations. One of them that has to do with the US And one of them that has to do with something that Professor Basu also mentioned in terms of the possibility of Mexico to diversify in terms of the markets where we now trade. That's the interconnectedness of Mexico with the US. If we click on the following graphs, that's when we add railroads, oil pipelines, gas pipelines, ports, airports, and roads. That's the North American region. And an interesting question to ask is whether this North American region is integrated because of NAFTA, or whether NAFTA makes sense because the North American region is integrated. Whether there's something about our demographics, the way our economies complement each other, that was highlighted, brought along, made to move faster because of the North American Free Trade Agreement, but whether we would have a very similar level of integration even in the absence of the North American Free Trade Agreement. That level of integration makes it difficult to identify where our borders are. It makes it difficult to identify where the US ends and Canada begins. It makes it difficult to identify where Mexico ends and the US begins. So we are going to have this debate as to how we want to move the North American integration process forward, but the starting point of that debate is the North American region. It's a North American region that makes sense. It's a North American region to which many infrastructural elements have been put forth. And it's a North American region that makes sense because of NAFTA, but it makes sense in the absence of NAFTA. We have the same demographics as the US had in the 70s. Our economics complement each other well. It's difficult to identify possibilities of growth in terms of capacity, for example, in the ports, if Mexico is not part of that equation. The only big refinery between Long Island and Patagonia is Salina Cruz in Mexico, and it's difficult to conceive of increasing refining capacity in the Americas if Mexico is not part of that equation. There are very few things that can come into play in terms of North America competitiveness if Mexico is not a part of that equation. And an interesting point from a research perspective is whether this was brought along because of NAFTA or whether NAFTA was brought along because of the way that the economies would have naturally integrated. But today, that integration process means that Mexico is the second largest buyer of US exports after Canada, that we're the first or second largest commercial partner of 29 to the 50 states, that we have become the most important investor in the US from an emerging markets perspective, and that 1 million people cross the borders legally every day, and 370,000 trucks do so also every day. And each one of those crossings, each one of those trucks, each one of those dollars traded, we trade more than $1 billion every minute, means that there's prosperity being created at both sides of the border and for the three countries. And just to end, and to highlight something that Professor Basu also said, Mexico has an interesting geography. We're probably the country that has the most belongings of every other country in the world. We're clearly North American by geography, by the way that our economies have integrated, but we're also a Caribbean nation, and therefore we share one of the most important resources in terms of tourism, which is the Caribbean Sea. We're clearly Central America, and Central America is interesting. There's as much Central Americans as there are Canadians. Central America has been growing at a rate of 3.5% per year, which means that Central America today is 60% higher than it was in 2000. Central America could become, therefore, a very interesting developmental study and play if we manage to make those economies more complex and have access to better energy, which is something that could happen because of the energy reform in Mexico. Mexico is very much Latin American, and the integration process with the Pacific Alliance and the degree of dialogue that we are now having with Brazil and Argentina make Latin America, again, an interesting process to watch from an integration perspective. We're part of the Asia-Pacific basin, so that makes us part, again, of the possibilities and dynamism that that region has. From a cultural perspective, we clearly have a belonging to Europe, from the way that our legal institutions are set up, for being part of the G20, as well as many European nations, from having a trade agreement with that region that's in the process of being modernized. But you would be hard-pressed to find a country that has as many belongings, either because of geography, because of culture, or because of different elements. And our challenge is, as Professor Basu said, to change those belongings into an expanded set of opportunities, which is something that Mexico is now pursuing very aggressively. Just to conclude, what should you expect from Mexico in the near future? You should expect a country that maintains discipline and consistency on its macro policy, that continues to implement the structural reform, that continues to make efforts so that the rule of law is current at all levels of the Mexican country, and that is in the process of defining the U.S.-Mexico relationship in a way that makes sense from a North American integration perspective. So thank you, and enjoy Mexico and this conference. And basically, I forgot, but the reason they invited me was not to give a presentation, but to formally, if you would do me the honors of standing up so that we can formally get this conference started. So being what day is it today? 19th. So being the 19th of June, we're very happy to declare this conference formally inaugurated, and we wish that it will be to the betterment of the economic understanding of the regional challenges, the global challenges, and that we come out of these events with more knowledge, better relationship, and more interconnected. So thank you and good luck.
We are about to start, so if you can take your seats, please. If you will please take your seats, we will start within a minute now. Okay, welcome everybody to the start of formal papers and lectures. We are starting 20 minutes late. I will give this session, I'll clip 10 minutes from this session so that we end 10 minutes late rather than carrying over the entire delay. But managing a Joe Stiglitz lecture is the hardest management task on earth. And I'm going to take that on and try my best. Friends, it's an absolute delight, I have to say. Creative economists in the world. And over a long period of time, really it just stands out. If you look at his work, the out-of-the-box thinking, suddenly getting a new idea when everyone is thinking conventionally, makes him stand out totally. And his early works, you're all familiar with. For me, one very important area is sticky prices. We used to work with sticky prices more or less as an assumption. You need it for the Keynesian macroeconomics to work. You need it in many places for Arthur Lewis's dual economy model to work. But Joe Stiglitz gave micro foundations to these sticky prices through his very famous work on labor, very famous work on credit. He's worked in a whole range of areas. Time is short, but I just want to remind you that in terms of measuring risk, when is one variable riskier than another variable? He did pioneering work on this, and at a somewhat remote level, but also not that remote, he's picking that up today because that work led to some very influential response from people working on inequality, because inequality measurement brought some similar issues. Joe has worked on growth. Joe has worked on inequality, and he's picking up on some of those earlier themes, and he's going to revisit that. The second, I said there are two traits of Joe which makes him very special, is Joe is instinctively a kind person who stands up for the underdog around the world and takes a lot of flack for systemically standing up for the underdog. He's done it consistently. And that is so instinctive in him. I'm going to give you one story which I'm not 100% sure it's correct, but we'll verify with him later. Years ago, after he had published a book, in a developing country, a publisher produced a pirated edition of the same book. And then it shows the innocent heart of the people who do some of the piracy. The publisher then wrote to Joe Stiglitz, asking him if he will write the foreword to the pirated edition of his book. And the only person I know whose instinctive response was, yes, I will, is Joe Stiglitz. Luckily, his publisher stopped him. He was not allowed to write that foreword. So this really sums up Joe in many ways. Well, with that, let me call Joe to speak, and then I will introduce Gaël Giraud, who's a discussant for Joe. I'll do that after Joe's talk. We are going to hold time very, very strictly because of the shortage, but because I also want a little bit of interaction with the audience. So, Joe, that's yours.
Well, Kaushik, thank you very much for that introduction. And the subject of my talk is inequality, wealth and income inequality. Let me begin with the question of what is that we are trying to explain. There's been enormous increases in inequality in income and wealth within most countries around the world. And it's striking that finally the economics profession is beginning to pay what I think is appropriate attention to this growth in inequality. This increase in inequality goes, in the advanced countries, goes very much against what is known as Kuznets' law, which talked about how in the early stages of development inequality would increase and then it would decrease. That actually happened in the United States until around 1980. But of course, Kuznets, writing in the 1950s, couldn't predict what would happen 30 years afterwards, and of course, then beginning in the 1980s, inequality started to increase again. So Kuznets had a very plausible explanation of the increase and then the decrease. The question is, what happened to Kuznets' law? And as you know, economic laws are not passed by Congress. They are a summary of regularities, and sometimes what we perceive as a regularity is only temporarily so. Another very related aspect of this issue is the distribution of income according to factor shares. When I was a graduate student, one of the theoretical challenges was to try to explain the constancy of the share of labor. Now, the theoretical challenge is to explain why it is that the share of labor has been going down so dramatically. You can't summarize something as complex as a whole income distribution. It's like summarizing a probability distribution, which was, as Kaushik said, one of the issues that I talked about many years ago. But what is so clear and dramatic about inequality in a country like the United States is that every part of the distribution is moved in a way that is characterized by more inequality. There's more money at the top. The share of income going to the top 1% or the 1/10 of the 1% has gone up. There are more people in poverty, and they're suffering more. And there's been an evisceration of the middle class. So I'm not going to talk about all of these aspects. I'm going to try to focus on a broad theoretical perspective. And what I want to emphasize that as we develop a general theory of inequality, that theory has to be not only explain this increase of inequality in general, explain or be consistent with what's happening to the shares of labor, but also has to be consonant with the other, you might call it stylized facts, like the Pareto tale. The Pareto tale just is a distribution of, is a description of the tail of the probability distribution of wealth at the limits. It was discovered by Pareto, and one aspect that still seems to be true, but the tail is getting fatter. That is to say, there's more and more inequality. Well, given the complexity of the issue, it is not a surprise that several alternative theories have developed. And I'm going to focus my remarks on one particular view, but I want to contrast that with another. The view that I'm going to be pushing is that there exists an equilibrium wage and wealth distribution, and what that equilibrium wage and wealth distribution represents is a balance between centripetal and centrifugal forces. That is to say, forces that are making the distribution of income or wealth or more unequal, and forces making it more equal. And you can describe the operation mathematically of these two forces, the centripetal and the centrifugal forces, and that an equilibrium represents a balancing of the two. And then, so what I'm going to try to do is describe some simple models in which that's generated. And what's nice about those models is then you can look at the parameters of those models and you can say, how has the economy changed? And the interpretation of the increase in inequality is that there have been changes in the parameters of the economy such that the forces pulling the economy apart, the centrifugal forces, have gained relative to the centripetal forces, which in many cases have weakened, and therefore there's a new equilibrium, wealth distribution with more inequality. So that's the view that what we are seeing, and we have been seeing, is a movement from a world with one wealth distribution to a world with a more unequal wealth distribution. There's another view which says capitalism is associated with ever-growing inequality. There was an unusual period after World War II where social solidarity was unusually great. There was a temporary change, you might say, in the way capitalism functioned, and that is not inconsistent with the theories that I'm going to describe as the core part of my analysis. But the basic view that in that perspective is that we are now returning, or beginning in 1980, 75, 80, we began to return to a world in which the normal rules of capitalism were working, and that in that world one will see ever increasing inequality. That model is particularly associated with important work of Piketty, and I should begin by emphasizing the enormous contribution that Piketty and his associates have made in gathering data, bringing new data, analyzing that data so that we have a much better database for understanding what is going on. But I'm focusing here on the theoretical model, and the question is, how do we explain this increase in inequality? And he put forward a simple but very forceful model in which capitalists save all or most of their income, so wealth grows at the rate of interest, the rate of return on capital. If the rate of return on capital is greater than the rate of growth, their wealth grows faster than that of the economy, and so there is ever-increasing inequality. In particular, not only does their wealth increase relative to GDP, if the return on capital doesn't decrease, their income does too. But that model assumes some very strong assumptions. One of them is that the savings rate is 1 or close to 1. In fact, it's much less than 1. And a simple anecdote explains, maybe give you a view of the difference between the actual world and the model of Piketty. When John D. Rockefeller died not quite 100 years ago, he was by far the wealthiest person in the world. And if the Piketty model were correct, his descendants today would have something like 1.2, 1.5, somewhat over $1 trillion. And the best compilation of the Rockefellers is that the family only has about $30 billion. And of course, there's a big difference between $30 billion and $1.2 trillion. And to make things even, to represent the hardship that they face, that has to be divided among 300 descendants. So they're barely surviving today, as opposed to the view in the Piketty model that they have become ever richer. And so the first thing is, the data is unambiguous that the savings at the top, even at the very, very top, is markedly less than 1. The second thing that's really core to what I'm going to be talking about is that the rate of return on capital is an endogenous variable. And if it were the case that wealth and capital were the same thing, which it is basically in the model that he presents, and if the capital output and capital labor ratio were increasing, it's hard to construct any model that makes any sense in which the return to capital eventually starts to decrease. So in the model that I'm going to describe in a few minutes, it is the case that in early stages of development, there can be a persistence of R, a return on capital, greater than the rate of growth. But eventually, in equilibrium, the product of the savings rate times the return on capital is going to be less than the rate of growth. And the implication of that is that this, what is described as this internal dynamic of capitalism leading to ever-increasing inequality, simply doesn't hold. So these are just some of the reasons that I'm focusing on the alternative explanation, which takes standard economic models and asks how can we explain the evolution of inequality, and particularly inequality in our society, in our economy. So in doing this, what I want to do is first construct what you might call a benchmark model. And I want to remind of the role of benchmark models in economics. The Arrow-DeBrugh model is you might say, a benchmark model. Nobody, except maybe some economists at Chicago, but nobody seriously takes the Arrow-DeBrugh model as a serious description of the economy. I guess there are still a few people in Latin America that do, but that's... but even though it is not a good description of the economy, it's a very useful model for understanding why markets don't work the way they should. And since Arrow and DeBrugh proved their theorem on the welfare economics, it has been the basis of the development of the market failure approach, which has really played a key role in understanding the role of government, the limits of markets, and so forth. So what I hope to do here is to construct a benchmark model which serves an analogous function for understanding, interpreting the growth of inequality. So what I'm going to do is begin focusing on that benchmark model in a very simple case, and using that to try to explain the growth of inequality. I'm going to admit at the end, it can't really do an adequate job. And what that tells us is that we have to go out of the competitive framework. And if we're going to understand the growth of inequality in our society, we have to look to the growth of things that are not incorporated into the standard competitive equilibrium model, and in particular market power, but also a whole variety of other sources of rents. In constructing this model, what we're going to do is trace out the evolution of family dynasties. A key part of this is macro-micro consistency. That is to say, if the capital income or capital labor ratio goes up, that has to have consequences for the returns to capital. And the sum of the family capital holdings has to equal aggregate capital. One can embed in that kind of model alternative assumptions concerning the determination of savings, reproduction, and so forth. And I'll focus on a core model, but it's easy to explore variations of that core model. And in general, they don't change the qualitative results. So the basic dynamics are really very easy to see. They're really the standard dynamics of the solo growth model or any other growth model, where families save, and that increases the wealth that they can pass on to their children. There's lifetime savings, but then they have to divide that wealth among their children. And so those are the two forces. There's an accumulation force and a division force. Perhaps the neatest result is that if it were the case that all families had the same wages, all had the same savings rates, there was no dispersion in returns to capital or in the reproduction rates, you would get that regardless of the initial distribution of wealth, it would eventually converge. There would be complete equality. Well, obviously this model doesn't provide a description of what is going on, and the reason is very clear. The way it's structured is there's only a centripetal force, a force pulling inequality down. If we want to have a centrifugal force, we have to introduce some source of variability. And introducing any source of variability in any of the variables of the model suffices to do that. So that means we have to go from our deterministic model, like a Solow or a Caldor model, into a stochastic model. And there are various ways of doing that. There was some actually very interesting work early on by Chapernow using Markov matrices, the probability of somebody in one generation being in a particular decile in one generation, being in the next decile in the next generation. If one uses the structural model that I put forward, adds uncertainty in a plausible way, one gets a version of the Chapernow model, and one of the results of that is that there is a steady-state distribution, and that steady-state distribution exhibits a Pareto tail. I'm going to use actually a slightly different framework where it's easier to calculate more precisely the shape of the tail, to see what is going on in inequality in the tail. And that's what is called, for those of you, is called a diffusion model. And it just basically says that there is a normal distribution in the case here, in the returns to capital. So that's what I'm focusing on here. Just assume that, take a simple model where there's not wage variability. Later on I'll introduce that doesn't change the qualitative results. Just introduce variability in the returns to capital, and you get an equation very analogous to one that I described earlier. But what is striking is you get a remarkably simple formula for calculating the Pareto tail in terms of the rate of growth, the rate of reproduction, the savings rate, and the interest rate and the variance. But what makes it even more interesting is that if we then allow this economy to evolve over time, and eventually it goes into steady state. So we're now looking at both the steady state in the wealth distribution and the steady state in the aggregate, in the capital-labor ratio for the economy as a whole. So we're in, you might say, a double steady state. So when we get into that, it turns out that there is an even more remarkably simple description of the degree of the inequality in the tail inequality, a brief description of wealth inequality in this economy. And that's related simply to the share of capital and the rate of growth. And so one then can ask, describe if there's a change, for instance, an increase in the share of capital, it will be the case that there will be an increase in inequality in the wealth distribution. So what we observe in the data that I mentioned before, that the share of labor has been going down, I'll talk about it a little bit more later. If the share of labor is going down, the share of capital is going up, then we would also simultaneously expect to see more inequality in the wealth distribution. Of course, what matters is the variance, the variability of the returns of those individuals in the tail of the distribution, the very wealthy, and they, of course, buy different assets than those of the rest of society. They tend to buy riskier assets, and of course that means even more inequality, tail inequalities. And this is just a chart that shows that the wealth, the top of the income distribution, is really holding common equity. They're owning the riskiest assets in our society, and changes in our structural economy, I'm going to come to in a minute, probably have made that even worse. So, as I said before, there are alternative models that generate differing stationary equilibrium. Given the time limit, I can't go into those, but the basic, the only important difference is the set of models that distinguish between life cycle savers and capitalists, long-term capitalists. And one can use this framework to look at that particular aspect of wealth inequality. There's one particular issue that is both useful for comparative statics and insight into policy. In Piketty's analysis, you remember a key variable was the relationship between the return to capital and the rate of growth. And so that leads very naturally to the suggestion of what would happen if we tax capital. That would lower the after-tax return, and it's after the after-tax return, and that could change the dynamic that I just described. But that's only if the before-tax return to capital doesn't change. And any of you have done, public finance in the economics of the public sector. The key issue always when you're talking about taxation, including capital taxation, is what is the incidence of the tax? So if you impose a tax, it will affect behavior, and that could have an effect on the before-tax rate of interest, and therefore on the after-tax rate of interest. So in fact, if we look at the very simple model, the Caldor-Passanetti model, that Piketty's model is actually very close to, what one sees is that in fact, in that model, in the long run equilibrium, there is full shifting. That is to say, the before-tax return, the before-tax return goes up so much that the after-tax return is unaffected by the imposition of the tax. So, unfortunately, what seems like it would have been an egalitarian policy does not, in fact, result in a decrease in wealth inequality. In fact, it's actually worse, because the adverse effect on capital accumulation means that wages go down, and if there's life cycle savings, the relative role of life cycle savings goes down, and so there's actually even more wealth inequality. One can ask the question, well, doesn't this depend on what we do with the proceeds of the tax? What happens if we give the proceeds of the tax back to workers? And one of the, again, I think striking theorems here is that, at least for small taxes, workers' decrease in well-being as a result of the decrease in the wages is greater than can be compensated for by the tax revenue that is distributed to them. So again, it's an unambiguously inequality increasing public policy. But there is an alternative public policy, which is to take the funds and invest them in public capital. And if they're invested in public capital, that is a relatively good substitute or a complement to private capital, then in fact one can actually get the result that workers can be made better off, and at least some aspects of inequality can be reduced. Well, given the limited time, I'm going to say one can use a very similar model of this to not only explain the distribution of wealth, but also the distribution of wages, and embed the two together to get a whole distribution of wages, simultaneous distribution of wages and wealth. As I said, the purpose of constructing this elaborate machinery, this benchmark model, is to explain the changes in inequality. Let me just step back for a second. When some of this earlier work in creating these models, when we did this earlier, we didn't have computer models where we could the only thing we could calculate was the tail inequality. Now actually we have computation power where we can calculate the whole distribution and get a much better view of what is happening to what these models say is happening to the whole wealth and wage distribution. So what I want to emphasize now is the usefulness of these models is to try to explain changes in inequality. And you do that by looking at changes in intergenerational transmission of advantages, changes in markets, changes in public policy. And given the limited amount of time, I just want to highlight a couple aspects of this. I think there has been an increase in the intergenerational transmission of advantage and disadvantage, partly by the result that in many countries, including the United States, there has been a move to more regressive taxation and a lowering of inheritance taxes. Trump has actually proposed eliminating inheritance taxes. And one of the strong centripetal forces bringing our societies together has been public education. And that has become weaker. And one of the societal forces making for more inequality is that there is more geographic economic segregation. One of the important aspects that, as you think about inequality today, there's some very peculiar things going on, because with monetary policy in recent years, the return to capital, as we normally talk about, the rate of interest has come down to zero. It doesn't seem like there's a scarcity of capital. And there's not a scarcity of labor, there's massive unemployment of labor. So you have to ask, where is the high returns that are generating inequality? Inequality has been increasing in a world in which return to the rate of interest is close to zero, and so what is going on? And the answer, of course, is the part of the scarcity is knowledge. And knowledge is hoarded more or owned disproportionately by those at the top. What I try to explain in the paper I've written is why that is so, but it is very clear that that is so. And that goes back to the notion that the nature of inequality in our society today has to be assessed by recognizing that those at the top not only have more wealth, but they hold that wealth in a different form, in forms which receive higher returns than the forms of wealth that that people lower down in the income distribution hold. Well, there have also been a number of changes in markets, and just two I'll point out to. One of them is, remember in that formula, what I said is that the share of capital plays a key role in the degree of wealth inequality, and that share of capital has gone up. The second is that in so-called innovations like structured finance have allowed the redistribution of risk, which means more risk is taken by those at the top, and that means, again, an increase in the variance at the top, and that means, in turn, more wealth inequality at the top. There's one more change in the structure of our economy that I think ought to get probably more attention to, and some people think plays a very important role, which is our move towards a service sector economy. In the service sector economy, typically production units are smaller than in fewer workers than in the large old-fashioned manufacturing industrial, and that means in the old industrial where you could have less individual accountability, there was a kind of wage compression that went on, and the movement to the service sector economy by itself could be expected to increase wage inequality. Changes in public policy have also played a role, and again, just to mention a couple, monetary policies, which QE has clearly increased wealth inequality because the return to capital of the form held at the very top has increased, while the return to capital of those held by ordinary citizens has gone down. And monetary policy with a focus on inflation has resulted in a greater output gap, resulting in downward pressures on wages. Public policy has also had the effect of increasing liberalization in many developing countries, exposing countries to more risk, and that increased risk, again, is the key variable in that wealth inequality that I talked about before. And so the result of that is that there is more inequality. Well, as I look at these changes in public policy, changes in markets, I am not convinced that they provide a persuasive explanation of the extent of the increase of inequality in our society. And that really brings me to the second part of my talk, which is that a key part of the increase in our inequality in our society has to do with rents. And these rents take many different forms: land rents, market power rents, like monopoly rents, intellectual property rents, and rent seeking from the public sector. There are a couple of key observations that I want to make. If there are these increase in rents, you can have an increase in wealth at the same time you have a decrease in capital. So you can think of wealth as physical capital plus the capitalized value of rents. And if the capitalized value of rents goes up, wealth can go up even though physical capital goes down. And this is not just a theoretical possibility. If you look very carefully at the national income accounts for many countries, including the United States, what you see is that almost surely has been happening. The capital labor ratio has been going down, or the capital effective labor ratio has been going down. Wealth output ratio has been going up, but that increase in wealth output ratio has to do with things like an increase in land values, the fact that land in the Riviera is more valuable doesn't mean that there's more land in the Riviera. And it doesn't increase the productive capacity of the economy. In some cases, if monopoly power increases, the value of rents goes up, but really the productive capacity of the economy goes down because the productive capacity of the economy has been distorted by monopoly power. So the general view that I take in the second part of this talk is that a lot of the increase of wealth is not capital but rents. It's very easy to construct a simple model where individuals save a given fraction of the income as they perceive it, and their income is their national income account income plus whatever capital gains they earn, and then they take that and they invest that in new assets and holdings, increased holdings of assets, which means assets whose values have gone up. And the net effect of that is that you can see in a very natural way that if savings rates as a fraction of national income is normally, savings rates don't change, a net effect of an increase in these capitalized value of rents will be a decrease in capital accumulation. One of the striking things is this kind of result is certainly consistent with a decrease, this kind of analysis is consistent with a decreased share of labor. And I want to call attention, this is work based on empirical work that's been done in a number of different sources, but quite often we talk about the share of labor as we get it out of the national income accounts. But if you take out the top 1% of workers, and in the terms of workers, our national income accounts will treat a CEO of a company as a worker, or will treat a banker as a worker. We all know they're not really working. They're actually engaged in exploitation. And so they're not workers in the conventional sense of what we mean in the share of labor. So if you take out that top 1%, what you see is the decrease in the real share of labor has been enormous. It's gone from something like 75% of GDP down to 60%. And another way of seeing this similar disconnect is that what I've shown here is what's happened to labor productivity and what's happened to workers' compensation. And you see until the mid-70s, the two moved parallel, and that was the observation that the share of labor was constant, no matter how you measured it. And then suddenly you get a change, a wedge, and productivity continues to grow, but workers' income is stagnant. That's, again, consistent with the view that something else has happened, something like rents. It wasn't as if suddenly around 1975, 1980, the technology changed. We went from one Cobb-Douglas production function to another. There was no evidence that the production function changed dramatically at that moment of time. And you get exactly the same kind of results, that was for the US, you got exactly the same kind of results for Europe. So let me just conclude and say that the bottom line of this analysis is that an important ingredient in the growth of inequality in many countries around the world isn't based on the model that I just gave in the beginning, but is really based on an increase in the rents obtained by those at the top. And then you have to ask the question, what caused that? And here the argument that I put forward is it's basically a result of rewriting the rules of the market economy. Markets don't exist in a vacuum. Often when we talk about economics to our students, we pretend that there are these rules of capitalism, but in fact, markets get structured by legal frameworks, by antitrust laws, corporate governance laws, bankruptcy laws, our whole legal framework, monetary policy. So we have a whole legal structure that structures our economy. And beginning with the Reagan-Thatcher revolution, we restructured market economies. United States and UK took the lead, but countries in the developing world, all over the world, followed that. Many countries call these good things called structural reforms. A lot of these structural reforms were, of course, making the economy less efficient by opening up possibilities for exposure to more risk and more inequality, less shared prosperity, and more market power. So the agenda going forward, the analytic agenda going forward is to try to understand more the links between these, you might call it institutional legal factors, and the distribution of wealth, the rents in our economy, and the effect that has on the efficiency of the economy. One of the effects, for instance, is that some of these changes in the rules led firms to act in a more short-term way, and that actually led to the slowing down of economic growth because there's less investment. Also argued that the disparity between average and marginal returns that opens up as a result of an increase in market power also leads to less investment, weakening the economy both on the efficiency side but also on the demand side. So what I hope I've done is to open up a framework within which one can begin to analyze this, probably the most dramatic thing that has happened to our economy, and with enormous implications for our politics, for our society. And that is, I think it really is incumbent for economists to try to understand better, how do we explain this enormous increase of inequality that has occurred in most countries around the world, and are there policies that can address it? And part of the argument of this paper is that not only are there policies that can address it, they can address it in ways that will enhance economic efficiency and growth. Thank you.
I will, thank you very much, Joe. We will move on to Gaël Giraud. Let me very briefly say, Gaël is in a similar mode, a brilliant mathematical economist who has written on a range of topics, from algebraic index theorem in Journal of Mathematical Economics to market games in economic theory, but of late his work has been with Agence Française, where he is the chief economist, and he's been active also in very similar practical ways again, reaching out to countries that are doing poorly, reaching out to parts of the world which needs help. So it's in a very similar mold he comes to this. He has, apart from the position in Agence Française, he also holds positions at Sorbonne and at the Paris School of Economics. I should also tell you that his recent work actually is in climate change and energy, and he's just fully involved in that, knee-deep, doing a lot of work. Today won't be the occasion where he'll get to talk about that, but hopefully there'll be interaction on that in the future. With that, Gail, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kaushik. It's a pleasure for me to be able to comment the huge talk that has been given by Joe. Of course, it's a daunting task to try to comment it, so we'll just focus on a few points. So as you saw, there are two main parts in the talk by Joe. One, which is to say we have to think hard to try to explain some striking status facts, namely growing income and wealth inequality for sure, decrease in labor share, the fact that the returns on capital seem not to decline now, and at the same time the short-term real interest rate is near zero, declining capital output ratio, etc. And for that purpose, what Joe claims is that we have to think from scratch a new benchmark model where we could see the interplay between centripetal and centrifugal forces. And then the second part says, but all these will not suffice. What we need to think about is the role of rents, which explains actually the gap between wealth and capital, and which makes the whole job of feeding inequality today. Now, let me just remind a few facts about Piketty's work and why it doesn't hold water. Actually Joe said it, but let me just stress it. As you know, the key variables are the total income Y, and then R, which is the rate on return on capital, then alpha, which is the capital share of total income, and beta, which is the capital to income ratio. So the whole book of Thomas is based on two fundamental laws. But the first one is a trivial accounting equation, which does not say anything. And the second one is false. Why? Essentially because, as Joe just said, the saving rate S is not constant in the long run. And what matters actually for the increase of inequality is not the inequality between R and G, but the inequality between SR, that is the saving rate times the return on capital, and G. And on every model you can think of, SR is going to be lower than G in the long run. In addition to that, if you combine the two fundamental laws of Piketty, then they imply that SR is always lower than J. So in a sense, Piketty's model is self-defeating. And last but not least, the fact that R might be higher than G is well known since a long time, but it does not imply that inequality are going to grow. What does the job is SR bigger than G. In addition to that, and in a sense, Joe made an allusion to this, Piketty is endorsing the US viewpoint on the famous Cambridge capital controversy, even though someone like Samuelson said probably the economists from UK were right. So it's very hard to think of capital as being one unique entity where you would put together plants and financial assets. You have to disaggregate it. And last but not least, also the standard solo model that is used by Piketty is a model without money. So it's hard to think how you can write 900 pages on capital without mentioning money, unless you believe that money is neutral, and unless you believe that the banking sector is not creating credit, which of course is not the case in real life. Now, this means that, as was said by Joe, we need an alternative benchmark model, and that's exactly what Joe is saying now. So, in a sense, the key ingredients of this model, if I correctly understood it, are, first of all, the key role of asymmetric information and scarcity of knowledge. Second, the need of an extension of, let's say, the Solo or the Caldo model into a dynamical model where you would have multiple equilibria. The main narrative that Joe has in mind is to say, it's not true that we have a unique long-run equilibrium towards which capitalism would lead whatever we are doing, but probably we are living in a world where there are multiple equilibria. And what happened in the 70s, 80s is that we shifted from one equilibrium with low inequality to another one with high inequality. And then the big question is, how do you shift from one equilibrium to another? And as you probably know, if you stick to general economic theory or DSG models, it's very hard to think of this. It's even probably impossible. So for that purpose, you need to change probably entirely your viewpoint and to think in terms of a dynamical system with multiple equilibria, with basins of attraction, where you could ask the question, to which basin of attraction of which equilibrium do we belong now? And isn't it the task of the public sector, let's say the public authority and the economist, to think of some public policy that would drive the economy towards the good basin of attraction, of the good equilibrium? And fourth, then of course we have to distinguish capital and wealth, as I already said it. And also there is a very important point that is made in the paper that Joe didn't have time to mention now in his lecture, which is the short-termism. And here I want to stress the fact that I believe that, let's say, the accounting norms, like the ES 39 norm, which introduced within the balance sheets of, let's say, banks, the fair value principle, are responsible for today's short-termism that we are facing. Then, of course, then what Joe says is that what matters is SR and N or J, and then also there's of course this very long-standing question: how do you explain the Pareto tail of distribution? Regarding this, I just want to mention a beautiful paper by Boulot and Choro, two colleagues of mine in Paris, which essentially does the following: it's game theory and finance. Consider the very simple situation where you would have two investors playing a fair zero-sum game in financial markets, where at each time period, each of them has a probability to win the money that has been put on the table. This probability is proportional to the wealth of the investor, but at time zero, they both have the same wealth. So it's an entirely symmetric game. You begin with the same wealth as your opponent. At each point of time, you put on the table a fraction of your wealth, which is constant, and then you play, and then you repeat the game infinitely many times. And the conclusion, which is very surprising, is that even though everything is symmetric, everything seems to be egalitarian, then at the end of the day, in the long run, only one guy will hold the entire wealth present in the economy. In other words, this means financial markets, even if they were fair in the sense that everybody would have the same chance to win, just proportional to your wealth, at the end of the day, there would be a unique investor earning everything, which is probably one of the reasons why financial markets are so attractive, because everybody believes he will be this guy. So I just mentioned this because I think these are the kind of very simple thought experiments that we need to feed the kind of arguments put forward by Joe. So these are numerical simulations of the wealth of the players that have been run by Boulot and Choro, and this is the Gini coefficient. So you see, we are going to a more and more inegalitarian situation, and at the end of the day, as I said, a unique guy holds everything. I skipped all the details. The second point I want to make is that there are actually already today a number of papers which try to go in the direction of the agenda, the research agenda that is emphasized by Joe. And this takes place within, I think, a kind of earthquake that is now shaking the profession of macroeconomists. As you know, last year, Olivier Blanchard published a paper saying, roughly speaking, DSG models are basically flawed. There is also a paper by Paul Romer, the current chief economist of the World Bank, who is therefore following both Joe and Kaushik, who says for more than 3 decades, macroeconomics has gone backwards. And there is a paper by Narayana Kochalakota saying we have to begin again macroeconomics from scratch. The choices we made some years ago, 20 years ago, for good reasons at this time, are not written in stone, not even in pen. And what he adds in his paper is that it will not suffice to change that just some epsilon. We have to change the paradigm. We need a paradigm shift in macroeconomics. And in a sense, that's exactly what Joe is pushing now. On this agenda, I believe that private debts do matter. You know that during a long time, a lot of people, including people like, let's say, Brian Unke, would say, you know, private debts are just a matter of distribution. If someone in an economy has a private debt, then there must be a creditor. Then when you aggregate them, it doesn't matter. But of course, we know that this is not true. And if you look at these figures, I don't have time to comment them, you will see that actually in the last decade, private debts have increased much more rapidly than public debts. And most probably, the main problem of a country like Japan, of the Eurozone, maybe also of the US, is that there are too much private debts, not public debts. Now, if you take this into account, you may ask the question, does the accumulation of private debt play a role in the growth of inequality, which would also fit in the landscape, the theoretical landscape built by Joe. So I skip all the details. In order to try to illustrate this, let me just mention a paper I wrote recently with a friend of mine, Matteo Scoracelli, which builds on an old paper by Akerlof and Stiglitz, 1969, which deserves, I think, to be much better known than it is today, which is a simple, Lotka-Volterra dynamics between employment and wages, using a short-run Phillips curve, and developing the kind of dynamical systems I was just saying this is exactly what we need. So we do this, we add dynamics of private debt, and then we ask, how does inequality between households, let's say investors and workers, evolve within these dynamics? And then the striking answer is the following. As I said, there are multiple equilibria. One of the equilibria, the long-run steady states, is, let's say, a good equilibrium, which is exactly the solo equilibrium, balanced growth path of Solo's model. That is the unique one that is taken into consideration by Piketty. Along this, if you converge towards this equilibrium, then it turns out that inequalities are not growing, they remain constant. Now, there are other equilibria, which are very bad equilibria, where it turns out that at the end of the day, there might be a collapse of the whole economy because of the excess of private debt. So you may have a debt deflationary path in the sense of Irving Fisher. And along this path, it turns out that inequality is growing. So that you could interpret these kind of small models as a saying, inequality is not just a problem of fairness, it's also a problem of efficiency. So that the whole dichotomy between, efficiency and the size of the pie on the one hand, and distribution and fairness on the other hand, this dichotomy is wrong, it's false. We need to reduce inequality in order to have more efficiency and in order to have more growth. Otherwise, according to these kind of models, which I think belong exactly to the kind of agenda that Joe is pushing, then it turns out that more inequality might be the signature of the fact that the economy today is working along a path that leads ultimately to a very bad steady state. Now, the last word I want to say is the following. I have also another paper which links, in a sense, inequality and climate. And since the whole Congress is also devoted to sustainability, let me just mention this. In this kind of model, which is also a dynamical model based on Joe's paper with George Akerlof, 1969, then there is a climate backloop, which is exactly the climate backloop of Nordhaus in his famous DICE model. And we can see that again there are multiple equilibria depending upon a number of parameters. Now, what you see here is the basin of attraction of a good equilibrium, of the solo equilibrium, long-run equilibrium, where the three variables are, the three axes are the wage share, employment rate, and the private debt to outcome ratio. So the z-axis is the private debt to outcome ratio. And here, this is the basin of attraction of the good equilibrium, meaning that if the world economy belongs to this bizarre set, then it will ultimately converge towards the good equilibrium. So the market forces will lead to a good final outcome. Now here you don't see it? Oh, it has disappeared. The same picture, sorry, it's a mistake, with climate change. And it turns out that the basin of attraction is much smaller, and that you need a much larger wage share in order to be more resilient towards climate change. In other words, and as far as I know, this is the first time we get this kind of result, there is a link between the distribution of income between wages and capital. And according to this kind of family of models, if you give more to wages, so if the wage share increases, you make the whole economy more resilient towards climate, which might be a good reason also to try to reduce inequality. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gail and Joe. Now, for reasons of time, I'll have to keep it to literally 5 minutes. And so if you have questions or comments, maybe we'll take 3. And it's one of those rare situations where comments are preferred to questions so that they don't have to answer. But you're free. Okay, let's take there. Yeah. And there was a hand next to you, so we'll go on there and one more somewhere. Okay, we'll take one there.
Thank you. Marek Dąbrowski, Bruegel Cases, Higher School of Economics. Excellent presentation, but major deficit of this presentation is that you spoke about national inequalities. My understanding is mainly in the United States. While we have several publications which demonstrate that global inequalities between citizens of the world, they are diminished since end of 1980s. So perhaps we face some sort of trade-off that globalization process, new division of labor, international, it helped in catching up of lower income countries, but at the same time via structural changes change also income distribution in countries like United States or other advanced economies.
So let's pass it to the person next to you. That will save time, and then we'll go there. Yeah.
I'm a journalist for Reuters. Hello.
Yes. If you stand up, maybe it'll be easier for them to see where it's coming from. And you can be heard.
I'm a journalist for Reuters, and I have one question on NAFTA. My question would be, why do you think the wage inequality has increased under NAFTA, and what could be done to close that?
And one more over there. Leo Becketti, I happen to recognize despite the glare.
Yes, University of Roma. I just want to ask to Joe whether you don't think it also a main driver of inequality has been international trade competition between high wage, low wage countries, and this race to the bottom. How much it is going to matter? Because I think it's a big actor in shaping what we are looking at, and how we can reverse this race to the bottom, which of course it can create good effects in the low wage countries, but bad effects in high wage countries, and make globalization politically unsustainable, no? The famous elephant-shaped graph.
Thank you very much. So Joe, if you can just keep a brief response to these.
Okay. Well, all three of the questions were actually addressing aspects of globalization and how it has contributed to inequality, and let me say, particularly in the advanced countries. Okay, so that's not the problem. Okay, this is more simple. Hello? I don't think this is working either. It is? Okay. Okay, so in a way, economists, I think, fell down in not explaining as forcefully as they should have done that the Samuelson-Stoper theorem, or the factor price equalization theorem, which it said very simply that global trade integration would lead to lowering of wages of unskilled workers in the advanced countries. You know, that was just a clear prediction of standard theory. And that meant in the advanced countries, it would lead to more inequality in the absence of government actions. So so that did play a role in maybe changing the wages of unskilled workers relative to skilled workers. But it doesn't explain why workers on average have done badly. And the chart that I gave is looking at workers on average. And so it wasn't just unskilled workers. Now, there is another aspect of it, which is that the bargaining power of workers as a whole was weakened because under the trade agreements, firms could go to the workers as a whole, skilled and unskilled, and say, if you don't take a wage cut, we will lower your wages. So in a way, it's, you know, Sampson Stoper played a part of the role, but I think a bigger role was played by the bargaining, the weakening of the bargaining power of workers. But let me also make it clear that these increases in inequality were not inevitable. What we've just described is that if it is the case that trade integration would have led to increased GDP, some of the increase in GDP could have been used for job retraining, for skill enhancement, for other kinds of actions, so that in principle, everybody in the advanced countries could have been better off. The fact that the Republicans in the United States opposed those policies that would have compensated those who have lost and retrained them for new jobs leads me to think in part that there was actually an active agenda to weaken workers' bargaining power. And so it wasn't an accident that wages went down because of weaker, you know, and there was not a compensation. It wasn't as if, we just discovered that trade integration led to more inequality and nobody told us about it. You know, it wasn't, as you know, Trump keeps saying, nobody told us that things were so complicated. Well, this is a case where it was perfectly clear what was going to happen, and many of those who were advocating trade integration knew it and actually welcomed the lowering of wages and the weakening of bargaining power. That was part of the agenda. And so that brings us back to the issue that Gail raised, which is there's an endogenous political economy here. There are multiple equilibrium, and what happens is that a society with a high level of inequality, of economic inequality, translates into a high level of political inequality, and they advocate for economic policies that reinforce that kind of economic inequality. And there are multiple political and economic equilibrium, some of which are better than in others. And then the harder question that I didn't get to is how you move from one equilibrium to another. But it's also the case, and I think this is really important, that changing policies can change the likelihood that you may move into one of those multiple equilibrium or another. Do I have time to respond to a couple? What?
Don't have time, Joe. Yeah.
Oh.
Because there are sessions which are back to back. I'm right? Sessions waiting.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
So
okay.
yeah. So we'll have to stop with that. Is very frustrating because it's such a rich set of ideas placed on the table that we could have gone on for a much longer time, and it's all done hurriedly, but that's the way these things are. Thank you very much, both Joe and Gail, and to all of you. Just one announcement. There is an INET Thought Leaders meeting that is going to take place in that room. So if you're wondering if you're in case you're wondering if you're part of the INET Thought Leaders meeting, then you're not. There are many other sessions going on, but the INET Thought Leaders is there, and lunch is going to be here discussing financing, development, and long-term capital. You'll collect lunch there and come in over here. So thank you. It's very nice. Yeah.